Ladies and gentlemen, I have with me today Chris Marquardt. Did I say that right? Did I get it sort of right?
That's sort of right. Yeah, it's okay, but it doesn't matter how you pronounce my last name. It's
Well,
it's different everywhere in the world.
well, I appreciate that. Thanks for not being so hard on me for mispronunciations. But I have Chris here today. He hosts the podcast Photography Tips from the Top Floor. And just looking at the charts right now, it looks like the show is ranked number 44 for visual arts in terms of the Apple Podcast charts in the U.S., which is incredible. He's been running the show for how many years have you been doing this, Chris?
14.
14 years.
I'm a
Wow.
fossil. I'm a dinosaur.
So tell me about it. So can you describe your show to us so we get an idea of exactly what your show's about?
Well, the original name was Tips from the Top Floor, and that did not give away anything about what the show is about, because I started it recording on the top floor of a building, and I thought it was a memorable name. But it's about photography. So a few years into the whole podcasting thing, I added photography in the beginning. So now it's Photography Tips from the Top Floor, makes it easier to find, bit of SEO there. And yeah, that's what it's about. I talk about photography. I I usually have uh, a little bit of something philosophical, something technical. I try to explain things, but not on a level where like, okay, press this button and press this button, more on a conceptual level. And yeah, so I'm I'm trying not to be the news show or the gadget show, because that's just not me. So it's about photography, but in general, and I try to make people walk away with a little bit of more knowledge, about just the general topic of photography.
Excellent. Yeah, and you mentioned you mentioned a word that's very near and dear to my heart in there, and you said philosophy. And I thought
Yeah.
that was interesting because doing a little bit of research on you, one of my favorite quotes that you had on your website was together, knowledge and art will always win. I thought that was really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about how you come up with that philosophy of combining knowledge and art?
I don't even think that's by myself. I think I just nicked that somewhere. But yeah, I mean the art. I've gone that path myself. I have had a lot of gear. I still have a lot of gear, and but I don't use much of it anymore, because I learned over time that you cannot buy skill. You cannot pay for becoming a better photographer. You have to put the work in. You have to learn. You have to live a photographic life to get better, to become better. The technology can help you to a certain extent, but the photography is about so many other things that have nothing to do with tech, nothing to do with what expensive lens you're shooting through. Yeah, it's about timing. It's about sensing what's going on there. It's about the connection between you and the subject. It's about so many things that you just can't buy.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with that, right? Because it's so tough too, because especially in the consumer culture we live in, where it's like very easy to get obsessed with the gear and to make excuses of, I'm not great at art because I don't have the right instrument if you're a musician, or if you're a photographer, the right lens. But you're right. It's so much more than that, isn't it?
I mean, it's interesting because with photography, it seems to be kind of a consensus among at least a certain part of the photographers that you need this camera and you need that lens. But if you're a trumpet player, you will instinctively know that you have to practice to become better. If you have a gig in 2 weeks, you will probably practice. If you have a photography gig in 2 weeks, I'm not sure that so many photographers go out and practice before that, and try to learn their cameras and learn what buttons do what. I think it's important to have that down, to know your camera in and out, so you can operate it in the dark upside down if you have to. So
Mm.
that's important.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. I've never really thought about it that way, but yes, all art does require practice in honing your craft, right?
Yes, yes. And
But
photography too. Yeah.
and potentially podcasting. So tell me about it. What right? Nice segue. I'll give myself credit. So tell me what got you excited about starting a podcast as a photographer?
Well, I always had this topic, and I'm completely self-learned. I've not studied this in any way, but I've always been dealing with it in, yeah, just almost excessively from a very young age. And I always try to convey some of that information to others. So at one point I thought, yeah, I could probably try to get into like local radio stations. And the place I used to live, there was a student radio. So I talked to them, and I could have gotten a slot at, I don't know, Wednesday night at 11:30 for half an hour. And then I guess there would have been 20 people listening to that. So that didn't really sound like I could actually reach someone there. So I declined. And shortly after that, podcasting happened. And my brother poked me, have you seen this podcast thing? And I checked it out. And now I was lucky that I had this other background in a technical field, in computers and internet. So I kind of instinctively knew that this is going to be easy to do, and okay, that was just one part, the tech part, but then also the sound part, because I also used to be a musician, so I had all the recording stuff. So I had a good microphone, or decent microphone. So that all together, having a topic to talk about, knowing the tech, it wasn't too hard to figure out how to build an RSS feed that you need for a podcast. It wasn't too hard to record something. And then I just thought, hey, let me give this a try. And I created that podcast, and I talked into that microphone, and I recorded a couple of episodes. I think I was sick at home at that time for a few days, so I was bored. So all this came together to start that show, and I put it online, and it found an audience pretty quickly. And there weren't that many other photography podcasts back then. Again, this was in 14 years ago, 2005. So that was just in the beginning days of podcasting. And yeah, I pretty quickly had an audience. And then I think a month or two later, podcast was picked up by iTunes. So that overnight turned my audience, it exploded my audience pretty much tenfold overnight. In 24 hours, we literally, I think we're talking 500, and then 24 hours later, 5,000 people being subscribed. So that was, yeah, mind blown.
Wow, that's wild. How did you measure back then? Do you have like measurement through your hosting platform, or what was the?
I used FeedBurner.
Okay, so they gave you stats back then.
And FeedBurner gave, I'm not sure, I'm not on FeedBurner anymore, but FeedBurner is this shim between the podcast and the listener, kind of a redirection service, and it counts subscribers, or tries to count subscribers, and it counts downloads and that kind of stuff. And yeah, that was, at that time, that was kind of the default measuring system, and it was pretty independent. And then Google bought them, and then they kept the service alive. I think is it still around? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it is. It's like, it's hard. I don't know if you can create a new account, but I think they've grandfathered in the old ones, but yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not there anymore, but for many years, that was kind of the de facto standard for many podcasts. If an advertiser asked for your numbers, you could point them there and say, this is independently counted by someone else, so you can trust the information. And yeah, that was kind of the way to do it.
Interesting. Well, so you mentioned advertisers. How long did it go? Did you eventually bring on advertisers? And if so, like, when did that happen? What stage?
So I personally rarely brought advertisers on at all, because I don't roll like that. I can't sell. I'm a photographer, you know. But I was signed with PodShow. Okay. PodShow was a company that formed back in 2000 and probably 2005, 2006. And they were probably the first company that would sell podcast advertising. And so you had to sign with them, and then they were exclusive, and they would give you podcast advertising, and then they kept a share, and you got a share. And that got some interest in the beginning. And then I think they rebranded to Mevio, Mevio, for a while, but they're not around anymore. But yeah, that got me some initial Yeah, a bit of advertising income, not too much, but I mean, I back then in the early days of podcasting, hey, there's advertisers. I'm a superstar. It was kind of a wild time. At least it felt like that.
Interesting. Was it like a pretty good relationship for you working with that third party to broker ads for you?
It was okay. That was also the time I learned how to read contracts, but I learned it after the fact. So,
Thrown in the
um,
fire.
well, it was okay, but I ended the relationship after a while because I wanted a bit more freedom.
Mm,
So, yeah.
that's fair. That makes a lot of sense. Um, well, yeah. So from that standpoint, so you mentioned you started out. How long did it take you to get those? You mentioned 500 listeners. How long did it take you to get those?
That was a matter of maybe a month. That was really
Wow.
quick. Well, again, podcasting was new. It had there were a few outlets, a few channels that you could advertise a podcast through, which again, iTunes wasn't doing podcasts back then. So there were a few websites and directories that had podcasts, and there was a very hungry audience back then. I mean, nowadays it's kind of the norm. You pick up a podcast, you have someone talking about your favorite topic. Back then, it was top 40 radio and maybe some talk radio, but not here in Germany. We really do not have that variety in radio programming that you guys have in the States.
Hmm.
Um, so people were hungry for, well, initially for ad-free topics that were like specific to a niche, to their stuff. Where else do you find someone talking about photography? Back then, I did that 3 times a week. I did 3 episodes a week.
Wow.
So that got a pretty good audience pretty quickly. There was also a lot of collaborations between podcasts in the beginning. First few years, there was a lot of getting each other on the show, plugging each other's shows. I don't see that much anymore of that, but even though the market is still huge, but back then there was a lot of networking, and that helped.
Mm. I'm curious, what was the feeling like back in like 2005, 2006 when you look and you have thousands of people listening to your like every one of your shows? Like, is that a pretty weird and sobering feeling for
Oh,
you?
of
Or
course, it's
what was that
very
like?
well. It's very wild because, of course, as you know, when you record a podcast, you usually sit in front of a computer and you talk into this black thing here, the microphone, and there's, well, unless you do a round table or something, then you're on your own doing that. But you're talking to, if you're lucky, thousands of people. And um, a year into that, okay. So the interesting thing is, I kind of made that more tangible because after just maybe half a year of doing it, my audience or members of my audience sent me emails asking if there was like a live version of that, a face-to-face version of that, some workshop kind of thing. So the audience kind of pointed me towards that idea of maybe holding a workshop somewhere, and
Mm.
I did that in early no, actually 2006. I did my first workshop back where I lived in southern Germany, and people came from the States. There were a few from the States. There
Wow.
were a few from the UK. There was one guy from the Netherlands. There were Germans. It was this eye-opening thing for me. I mean, I in my former job, I used to do training, so it wasn't an alien concept for me. But seeing that this might have some legs
Wait. So
was
how
wild.
did you just sell like tickets on PayPal or something, or how did you do that?
Back then, I was self-employed. I had my own gig, and I just no, I did. I told my audience on the podcast, and enough of them were crazy enough to come to Germany and spend a long weekend with the podcaster doing a photo workshop. And yeah.
That's great, but you didn't charge them for it or anything. It was
Oh,
just
no, no,
free.
no, no! It was a paid workshop. It was a paid workshop. This is, I mean, I I'm not even sure how much I charged. It wasn't too much, but it was a paid workshop, and I made it clear that this is a business thing, in addition to it being a community thing. But it opened my eyes for, wait a minute, people are actually coming here to do this. And just a year later, I think 2007, I'm the majority of my audience is from the United States, still is, because that is the first podcast market that was there. And just a year later, I went to hold 4 workshops in the States. So I did a little tour, organized with the help of some listeners and some locals who helped me organize and like rent a room and get some stuff done locally. And that was again sold out, and it again opened my eyes even more. And so this is one of the things that I've done ever since. I do workshops, I teach photography, because it's just an extension of the podcast. It's and it wouldn't have happened without the podcast. So it goes back to that.
That's awesome. Well, I love hearing that you're taking your audience out of the virtual land and into the
and that's
reality,
awesome.
I guess.
The meeting people face to face makes it real all of a sudden. It's always this virtual game. You're talking to the microphone, and there are people, and yes, you of course you have a back and forth. There's email, there's Twitter, there's whatever. So we have a Slack for the show where people hang out, and so there's a community. But every time I meet people face to face, it just makes it that bit more real, and that's awesome.
Absolutely. Well, so you mentioned, you went from 500 monthly. Was it monthly listeners, or what was it, like per episode, or what was it?
It was that's the subscriber number that FeedBurner gave me, and FeedBurner did some strange half secret math. But so they looked at different clients, different IP addresses. They filtered out the robots and came up with that magic subscriber number. The actual download numbers were typically a bit lower, but not that much. So I'd say about 500 listeners initially.
Okay. And so then you obviously, iTunes introduces podcasts. You have a huge kind of step function increase in terms of listenership. Do you mind sharing where you're kind of at today in terms of monthly listeners or subscribers, or give a rough idea of how big the show is today?
Well, within a month, there's some, let's say 250,000 downloads at this point.
Wow. That's incredible. Congratulations.
I'm happy about this. I'm very happy about this. No complaints. You won't hear me complain.
So are there any big things that you've done tactically to grow your audience, or has it kind of just been slow organic growth?
It's very, very organic. I mean, I am on the usual suspects platforms. I am of the belief that it doesn't really matter if someone puts advertising around my show or not. I don't care about this. I mean, I'm in Stitcher and so on. No, I want to be available for people to listen to. I think that's the most important thing, that people should be able to listen to my content wherever they want to. It's their choice. So I try to be on many platforms, but I have one. That's not even strategic. It just again organically happened. I have one, let's call it an amplifier, and that is a tech radio guy called Leo Laporte. He runs the Twit podcast network.
Okay.
And I listened to him back then, and he had for tech nerds like me, he had a few and still has a few really cool shows. And I ran into him. There was a podcast conference back then in Southern California, and I went there, paid for it out of my own pocket, went there, and I ran into him, and we talked. And just a few weeks later, I realized that he has this weekend radio show, the Tech Guy Show, syndicated all over the US, and he doesn't have any photography content on there. I mean, he talks for 2 hours about tech, and photography is tech. At least when you look at today's cameras, it's very tech. So I sent him an email and said, "Remember me from the podcast conference? I noticed you don't have photography. Want to have a guest on every now and then?" And he's like, "Sure, of course, let's try this." And it turned out that his listeners liked it. I'm on there once a week on Sundays, 12:33 Pacific, around noontime, and it's a 10-minute slot about photography. Now that the audience is not photographers, so we're keeping it fairly basic, but this has been going on for like 12 years, every Sunday almost.
Wow.
And it's another outlet. It's another way to reach people. And I do get the odd booking for one of my photo tours, which another thing I do, which came out of the podcast. So yeah, it's worth doing it. It's great.
Wow, that's a really cool idea. So you were a fan of his show before you reached out to him? It sounded like, is that right?
Say it again.
Were you a fan of his show before?
Yes, I was. Yes.
Okay, so it was just like a very natural fit then.
Oh, totally. I mean, so I have these two sides in me. I'm a techie, but I'm also on the arts side of things. I used to be, I used to be a musician. I'm a photographer. I wanted to become a sound engineer, but then I found out that there's an ear disease in my family. There was a good chance I would have that, and so I decided to not go that route, and instead went the other way, which was more in the technology. And I went into computers. I worked for Hewlett-Packard for over 10 years, and yeah, so I have these two sides in me, and I always in my jobs, in my professional life, I always used to be the conduit, like the translator between the tech people and the business people and the customers. And so I always try to keep my feelers in different sides. And this helps me a lot when I do the podcast, because it's easier for me to put myself into the mind of someone who has a seemingly simple question. And I do have that channel into the show where people can leave a voicemail, and I play them and then I answer questions. That's another part of the show. And that, yeah, it just helps to be able to understand where the other person is coming from, and then try to translate this into a solution. And that's something that I've seen with Leo Laporte a lot. He's been doing that a lot because he answers listener questions on his show. So I modeled that part of my show after what he's doing.
Very cool. That's really cool to hear. I mean, that's an excellent way to get out to a much broader audience, right? I think that's super smart. Well, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Interestingly enough, the listener numbers of Tips on the Top Floor have not really jumped a lot since I've been on that radio show every week. Now I firmly believe that audiences just don't change their medium. I think people use the medium that they love, that they're used to, and getting them to use a new medium it's not going to happen. I mean, you won't make someone who reads Huffington Post go out and buy newspapers all of a sudden. People just don't do that. So I think even radio listeners don't really turn that easily into podcast listeners, because it's a different kind of consumption. In radio, you have that body that curates it for you, right? They have this endless stream of stuff coming to you. You just have to turn it on. And with podcast, well, it's your game. You choose what you want to listen in what order, and so it's a more active kind of listening. And I think that a lot of listeners are, well, they do it the way it feels right for them. And for some, it's the curated approach. For some, it's the more active approach. I could not live without using Castro and selecting exactly what episode in which order I want to listen. I couldn't have someone else do that for me. But that's just me.
Right. I guess that's a good point. Like, you have to go where your audience is. And so
Yes, you do.
and so despite the, the broad reach you get with the radio show, what you're saying is it's not necessarily exactly where your audience is. Well, it does build credibility for you. It sounds like you've gotten some inbound as a result of that. It maybe doesn't do as great of a job as complete, like, of going right
It,
into your audience funnel, right?
it doesn't. There is an audience there, but they don't mix that much, and it's a different kind of audience because I'm talking to non-photographers on that radio show. I'm talking to photographers on my podcasts. So yeah, two different hats.
Interesting. To that point, have you experienced at all with having guests on your show or being a guest on other shows, kind of like this one?
Yeah.
And how has that kind of impacted the show?
Yeah, I I don't know, to be honest. I mean, it's always great to be able to talk to other people. I do have guests on my show every now and then, but it's usually not in a huge way. I might have a guest every 2-3 months, maybe. It's usually just myself. On that show, I do other podcasts as well. But yeah, it's most shows I can't go out and measure like a jump after that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's hard to measure these things because there's so many factors that go into that. I think no one can expect to have guest X, and then all of a sudden everything changes. I think the growth is much more organic, much slower. I mean, if this show is out, there will be people listening to it. There will be people who want to check out my show and listen to it. But I don't know when they listen to your show. So it could be 5 months down the road and they find something, or it might be someone who knows me and wants to know more about me and goes searching for other podcasts that I've appeared in. So I again, I believe in the organic growth. I believe in yeah, just being myself and most important, doing what feels right to me. There's a lot in the gut here, a lot gut feel
Yeah.
decisions happening.
Yeah. And that's kind of refreshing to hear too, because I think, sometimes as content creators, especially those who are maybe on the other side of success than you are, that are still on kind of the come up, so to speak, sometimes they think, or we think, I'm guilty of this myself, that one big interview, like, or I get this massive guest, or, I become a guest on this massive show, like, that's going to be it. That's going to be the moment. Then I'm going to make it. This is going to go viral. But in reality, that's not ever really how it works, is it?
I mean, I will do anything to make people aware of this show. I will definitely talk about this interview on my podcast. So definitely, people will come. There will be a stream of people coming over, but I have no idea how big that's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's organic growth. In the early days of podcasting, where 2004, 2005, 2006, maybe even 2007, in the first 3 years, there was this meme of I'm gonna quit my day job. I'm going to be the big podcast mogul publisher. We're taking over from radio. Obviously, that hasn't really happened. The radio has discovered podcast as a delivery platform to reach new audiences. So and there's still plenty of independent podcasters out there, which is great. But um, the enthusiasm initially was huge, and after doing it for over 14 years, I can tell things take their time. I mean, the fact that I now have sponsors on some of my shows, and that podcasting is a part of my living. I think it's like with everything. I don't think there are one-hit wonders in podcasting. Or I think a band or a musician once said, "Took me 10 years to become a one-hit wonder,"
Right.
or an overnight success. I think that's the term.
Mm-hmm.
10
Yeah.
years to
Right.
become an overnight success, because you need a lot of hard work until people notice you, and that includes the networking. So I appreciate being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like, hats off to you for having that consistency over almost a decade and a half at this point. Like, that's Incredible. I mean, but that is also kind of a common thread with all the guests that I have on is it's consistency. It's never one big break. It's never, sure there are big moments where you turn a corner, so to speak. But for the most part, would you agree that it's been just consistent uh, putting in the work, right?
100%. Absolutely. That's it. Put in the work. The podcasting is the first time in my life that I've done something this regular and this consistent. And the reason is, well, first of all, I managed to build a community, so there's interaction going on. The workshops have kept it real for me and have kept it like tangible for me. So I know there is an audience out there, and I know they want to hear a show, and that helps me kick my own butt and say, okay, let's record one. Be consistent. Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest tip for anyone. Don't give up after 3 months because you haven't had the big break yet. So that's not how it works.
So I'm curious, how did you stay motivated in those early days? But I mean, I guess it does sound like you had, from the get-go, a pretty decent following. But how did you stay motivated in the early days when you maybe didn't have as big of an audience as you have today?
It was, well, funny thing is when I started podcasting, when I thought, oh, let's try this, it's an experiment, let's see how it goes. I thought that I might be done explaining what photography is about in a maybe 10 episodes. That was my initial thought. And when I had those 10 episodes, I told this my listeners. I'm like, yeah, I don't really know if I can talk that much about photography, and they all sent emails and said, "Are you crazy? You got to continue." So that was definitely motivation. And then, of course, the questions started coming in, and that's when I realized that, well, first of all, there is new audience. It's not just growth; it's also churn. People also leave and go to another podcast, stop listening. So there's always, the audience always gets refreshed in some way, and so the same questions keep coming up. And then I thought, but you can't talk about the same thing more than twice, maybe. But what it turns out that over time I learn, so I change my viewpoint about certain things, and I look at things with fresh eyes, with additional information, so I can go back to questions and become, or come up with a better answer that I didn't have maybe 5 years ago. So there's a repetition of things, but then there are also new aspects, and yeah, this whole thing is, I'm not afraid to not find new topics, and that motivates me because the learning motivates me, because in order to answer a question, I might have to go out and research and find someone to help me answer that, because I don't have all the answers. And this way I learn, and this way I become a better photographer. And so that's another part of the motivation, is just the ability to use it to grow myself.
Interesting. Do you have like a consistent process? Well, we're using that word consistent over and over again now, but do you have some sort of system or a process in place that makes it easier for you to be consistent? I know you mentioned you have call-ins. Like what is your process for creating a new episode on a weekly basis?
What is the process? Well, I collect information throughout the week. I often don't know what I really want to talk about until half an hour of starting to write a few things down. Because there's this there's a funnel, there's a document that I throw things in throughout the week, and then I go through it and say, okay, this is interesting, this is not interesting. Or sometimes something happened, sometimes a new experience, something that I didn't have before, or something that made me go, that's interesting. I think I should talk to my audience about that. And this all goes into like a repository where I collect everything, and then I go through it and I sit down and I make some notes, usually just some bullet points. Sometimes if it's too complex of a thought, I actually write it out and then try to say it as if if I'm not reading it. Which also over time you learn to become better at the writing, so that it doesn't sound like writing. And then I usually record segment by segment. So I have a segment I want to talk about. I have an intro, and then I go into an initial segment, which is usually let's say, the philosophy part. And then I might have an ad break, depending on if it's one or two advertisers. I don't put more than two advertisers on an episode. And then the second part is usually answering audience questions. So that's the call-ins that I have, the voicemails that I have that I go through. And I record that bit by bit and piece it together. I also at one time produced the show just in one bit, including having the intro and the outro ready and firing them off from a soundboard and having this whole show to tape, so to speak. And both work for me. The show to tape takes more preparation, but then the recording is faster. The other way, by recording it in snippets, is you can do it with less preparation, just wing it a bit more, and because you can easily repeat bits if they don't work out. But then the actual recording and production takes a bit longer because you have all these snippets. So yeah, but that's what works for me. But then when I'm on the road, the Photography Tips from the Top Floor is not the only podcast I do. There are several others, and some of them I record in one go on an iPhone. And
oh wow,
yeah, so I really kind of try to I try different things, and some things work better for certain types of shows than others. So, but this one is the one I sit here in front of this microphone and I do it bit by bit by bit.
Interesting. Do you ever record like a backlog of content so you're a little bit ahead, or is it a weekly thing for you?
Well, I try to release weekly if I can. I do skip a few in a year, so maybe it might be 45 episodes a year. In addition to the workshops, the one thing the podcast has also brought me is the ability to travel, to offer photo tours to people. So I travel the entire world, and what that means, and that's maybe 4 or 5 times a year. And what that means is that for those times, I typically need pre-production. So I try to get something pre-recorded for those, but I don't have an ongoing buffer of shows ready. So if there's an emergency of some kind, yeah, that might mean that I skip a show.
Got it. Okay. Well, so you mentioned a little bit. You mentioned the workshops, obviously, photo tours. And it looks like you also do some other consulting work, and you have some books. How has the podcast played into your business overall, and what are some of the products that you've built that in addition to the ones I just mentioned, that I don't know, that have helped grow your personal brand and your personal business?
Funnily enough, everything I do right now goes back to the podcasting. Because before that, I was an employee. I worked for others, and at one point in 2005, I actually lost my job. I was laid off. It was a big workforce reduction wave. I think they tossed about 5,000 people in Europe. So I was one of them, and at that point it was like, damn it, I lost my job, but hey, that's an opportunity. So I chose to try the self-employed route. For the first year of building my own business, I actually made that into a podcast, a weekly one, where I discussed and talked about my progress and talked about my failures and talked about.
Oh, that's super cool.
So yeah, and I used the Top Floor brand, so that the show was called Up to the Top Floor, and it helped me sort my own mind, my own thoughts. It helped me structure things more. I get some valuable feedback from listeners. So I use the podcast as a tool to help myself, and other people found that interesting enough to come on the ride. And so the podcast has spawned the workshops, and that has led to travel, and that has helped me network a lot. And I met a very good friend, John Miller, through the podcast because he's a podcaster. And I sent him an email that I was a fan, and he sent an email back and said, "Are you crazy? I'm a fan of your show." So that was kind of an instant friendship, and we ended up becoming good friends. And he's a filmmaker, so he brought up the idea to take a group of photographers on a photo workshop to the Himalayas, and we pulled that off in 2009 together as the Everest Trek. So we did a photographer trek up to Everest Base Camp in 2009 with 10 people.
Oh wow!
Which was I'm not a sporty guy at all. So for me that was a change in my life because it meant I had to get more fit, and I stopped smoking, which I was a smoker back then. So it changed a lot of things. I got more healthy. So podcasting did that for me in the end. And then out of that came a lot of Himalayan travel over the years, and that ended up turning into a bit of a travel business. So nowadays I've been to Ethiopia, I've been to Svalbard, which is almost up at the North Pole. The Arctic is very important for me. I've been to Russia. I've been to lots of places, Bhutan, Central Asia, lots of that. So I've turned this into, the podcasting has helped me. Podcasting is, it was never planned to be, but it has turned out to be a great platform to reach people who have the same interests. Especially if you are yourself on the pod. If you don't try to be someone else, then there's a good chance that you will find an audience that clicks with you, an audience that understands you because they are kind of similar to you in their thought structure, in their brain structure. And it really turns out that that's true. So I'm not trying to be someone else on my podcast. I'm myself as much as I can. I might be a bit of a overhyped version of myself, but not too much, to be honest. And the people I've met through that, who come to my photo tours, who travel with me, there was always a good rapport, always kind of a instant friendship almost.
Yeah, that's incredible, and I think you're touching on a very interesting point, because I think a lot of times when people think of podcasting, especially, in like the recent, quote unquote gold rush of podcasting over like the last couple of years, everyone thinks that you can just kind of create a podcast, build an audience, and monetize through, advertising or premium content. But I love the approach that you have, which is you've built an entire business that obviously the podcast plays into your flywheel, and sounds like it plays a huge part of your flywheel, but you also have other products and services that feed off of your podcast, right?
It's interesting because the teacher, the photo teacher, I'm now also doing books, which is something I never thought I would do. I never thought I'd become a writer. But part of that came out of the workshop business, because we at one point, and we is my partner Monica and we are both photographers, and we kind of rediscovered film photography after having been digital for 10 straight years. But there is something about film photography that we thought we hadn't really fully explored. So we offered a workshop around that and made it accessible for people to learn and figure out what it means. And that again was discovered by a German publisher, a photo book publisher. And they approached us and asked us if we wanted to write a book on film photography. And I mean, of course, I instantly said yes before thinking about what that actually means. But that is something that has now led to, in total, between the two of us, to I think 4 or 5 books. Some of that has been translated to different languages. The latest one that I did about wide-angle photography, which is a very niche topic, is now available in Taiwan. It's been translated to Chinese, which
Nice.
again, I've no idea how this could all happen, but yeah, I'm blown away. So the whole thing, again, it all goes back to sitting down back in 2005 and recording a bunch of episodes of my podcast while being sick at home, and it has grown into like almost a little podcast network. There's other podcasts. There's another podcast that I do in Germany, here in the German language, together with a co-host. So that's a podcast that we don't record in snippets. That's two guys nerding about photography for a couple of hours a week. I do a couple of podcasts that are completely not about photography. One is about gluten-free diet because my mother has celiac disease, so I made this in a little family project. She and I talk about gluten-free nutrition once a week in German. There's another podcast that came out of the travel, which is about the polar regions, called Curiously Polar, which is two guys and a few guests every now and then talking about anything about the Arctic and the Antarctic, from social things to how to survive up there. And then there's one more about photography that's just a year old now, but it's called The Future of Photography, because on the one hand, I do film photography, so I'm rooted in the old ways of doing things, but hey, photography is in the middle of a huge change, in the middle of a huge, fast, quick development with computational photography, with a lot of things that no one expected to happen this quickly. And I think we ain't seen nothing yet. And so the photography, looking into the future, what's coming up, is interesting. And I started this with a co-host, but we recently thought we need a bit more of a diverse cast of people because it's two middle-aged white dudes. That's not very exciting. So we did a casting call, and we had people send in 1-minute casting tapes to us, and we have now a team of 4 people that does a weekly show about the future photography, which again, lots of different angles, very tech, very artsy, very well. We have one guy is a Hollywood director, one is a woman with an arts background. So yeah, I'm just trying to keep it interesting. What was the original question again?
Well, I was just asking about your products and things like that, and how you've kind of built it. And it's really cool to see how you've built other shows that also fuel your interest. Like, it sounds like you were a creator through and through, right? You just love making things.
Oh
Is that
yes,
true?
obviously. And with podcasts, that's the one thing I know how to create. So I'll keep doing it until I run out of time to do it.
Nice. I love it. Well, so I guess one of the kind of last questions here before we wrap up, with just the final 5, which are the last kind of few questions I have for the interview. Where do you see, because we talked about the future of photography a little bit, where do you see the future of podcasting going overall?
I mean, I've seen this development for 14 years now, and we have had a very good run of tool development. You know, when something new comes up, there are no tools, so people have to be very crafty of finding out how to do it and do a lot of that manually. And then there are tools that help you do it. And nowadays there's apps on your smartphone where you can like press a button and record an entire podcast. And so we have had that. I think a few styles have been established in like the classic roundtable and different other kinds of shows. There's some innovation, of course. And my personal wish is for podcasting to continue to be this creative playground of people trying out new things and being just brave enough to go out there and talk and have others hear them and maybe critique them. The moment you're out there, you can also be critiqued. So you're making yourself a bit vulnerable, of course, but I think that's very important. I'm afraid that there's also that other movement that I'm not a fan of, and that is the platformization of podcasts. Spotify is trying to become the podcast host. There's Stitcher. There's like others who now have exclusive content and try to lure people onto their platform this way. I think we have to really keep an eye on the freedom of podcasts, that a podcast will always be like free and available for everyone. The good old RSS feed is there and it should be used as opposed to something proprietary. I'm kind of curious. So there was a recent announcement, well, it's not even an announcement, a rumor that Apple is planning to do something similar, of becoming a podcast platform with exclusive content. Again, I have mixed feelings about that, but yeah, I want this to be to stay a free and creative platform. So far, it has been that, and I have a good hope that it's going to stay that way. But yeah, careful with the platforms.
Do you see an opportunity for maybe a freemium type of thing where content producers could maybe put out 3 episodes per week and 2 are free and 1 is kind of put under a paywall? Do you see any sort of room for that?
I've seen that business model work for a few shows. There's one here in Germany, a tech show. There's 4 or 5 people talking tech. And the way they monetize this is that they have a pre-show and post-show, which is 5 to 10 minutes before the actual show and 10 minutes after it, where they talk about a few more things and they're like more relaxed, and they sell that as the extra bonus kind of content. But I haven't seen many be successful with that model. So, and interesting enough, I tried to offer my Patreon subscribers shows without ads. I announced that on the show, and I told them, how would you like to receive as an incentive to become a Patreon subscriber, how would you like to receive a show without ads? And I got a very clear response from I'd say within one day, 20, 25 emails from people saying, don't. We like your ads. You do a good job reading them. We learn things, and you should use your time and energy for more important things. So I don't know. I mean, monetization of a podcast is, I haven't seen that many that succeeded with just going out and becoming a paid podcaster within a year.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess you also, I mean, you have to listen to your audience, right? I mean, you have to figure out what exactly they want and provide it to them. And it seems like across the board, nobody really wants to pay for podcasting, because the spirit of the platform, like you mentioned, is that it is, or the spirit of the technology rather, is that it's a free product and it's for the masses, available for free, right?
And there's so many opportunities to monetize around it, as I'm telling you. I mean, the workshops, the travel, the books, and that kind of stuff takes a while to build that up, but I think that's fair, because the audience can choose. And I even don't mind if anyone skips the ads. That's fine. I mean, yeah, it's an organic thing and it takes its time, but it's very satisfying if it then kind of works out.
Excellent, man. Well, so Chris, where can people stay in touch with you? Where is the best place to find your shows and get in touch with you?
Tipsfromthetopfloor.com is probably the easiest place to go, and from there you'll find everything, my photo tours, my workshops, my books. Yeah. Tipsfromthetopfloor.com or tfttf.com.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll link up to all that stuff in the show notes so people can easily access it. Let's wrap it up here with the final 5. Chris, number 1, what is the best book that you have read recently?
It's a photography book, of course.
Nice.
It's I'm blanking on the title. It's by Duchemin. Let me look it up. Oh, Sehen und Gestalten. It's the German version of the book. I don't even know the English title of it. But yeah, David Duchamp.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Awesome. Well, number 2, who are some of your favorite podcasters out there right now?
I listen to quite a few German podcasts. I listen to the usual suspects, NPR, some shows from NPR, which again they use podcasting as a vehicle, but still they've been around pretty much since the beginning of podcasting themselves. I listen to some of Lil Laporte's shows. But I listen less than I want to because I do 5 weekly shows. So the production time really takes away from the listening time. It's really funny because I love podcasts to bits, but I cannot listen to them as much as I want to.
Only so many hours in the day, unfortunately.
Yes, true.
Number 3, you big pizza guy? Do you like pizza?
I do, yeah.
What does your ideal pizza look like?
Simple. It's margarita with ham on it.
Okay, I can get on board with that.
Yes,
I can
very
get on
simple.
board with it.
Sometimes, I mean, I'm not even against pineapple on pizza, but very rarely.
On special occasions only.
On very special occasions. Yeah.
I'm with you. Number 4, dead or alive, who is the any person throughout history, who would you love a chance to interview?
I would like to talk to. Well, I already have a few of those under my belt, to be honest.
Oh, that's awesome.
Steven Sasson, the inventor of the digital camera, for example, I did interview him. He's the.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, that was a crazy coincidence that we got a hold of him. But I would probably like to talk to Mr. Spock.
Okay.
Or
Leonard Nimoy, is that right?
Or Nimoy, because Leonard Nimoy wasn't only someone who kind of was around on TV when I was a kid, but he also was a photographer. Now he's not alive anymore, but he was a photographer too. A lot of people are photographers. Jeff Bridges is a great photographer.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
I didn't know that. Well, he seems like he's pretty much as good at everything, though, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's awesome. Look up Jeff Bridges and his photography. You'll see some interesting stuff, behind the scenes stuff as well from some of the movies he did.
Yeah, I love it. All right, I'll have to check it out. I'm big Lebowski fan, so that checks out.
Very good.
Last question, Chris. If you were to start over from scratch today on a new podcast, or ask maybe a different way, if you were going to give advice to someone starting a podcast today, what would you do differently, or what advice would you give?
Don't look too much on the technology. Don't try to find the best microphone you can. I do record a couple of different shows on a smartphone. It's not about the microphone. It's about how you hold it, and it's about how you talk into it. They sound like they've been recorded in a studio. So don't spend on expensive technology. Talk about what you want to talk about, what you find interesting, and don't let the technology get in your way.
Perfect. Well, good advice. Get out there, make the stuff, get started. It takes a while, but if you keep at it and you have good content and you're yourself, if you're authentic, like you mentioned, you can have success. Take it from Chris. Be sure everyone check out Photography Tips from the Top Floor and all of the other awesome podcasts that you just talked about. I'm really interested to check out the Polar one, so I'm gonna
go ahead and do that. Curiously Polar.
Curiously Polar. Awesome stuff. Well, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me.